Attend now, citizen of the Imperium, and consider the figure who walks before you in the half-light of the under-hive. He wears robes stiff with the dried blood of heretics. He carries a chainsword the size of his own torso. His face is hidden behind a hood and a mask, because his face does not matter. What matters is the function. What matters is the work. He is a zealot, and in the long catalogue of weapons the God Emperor has placed in the hands of his servants, he is among the most useful, the most terrifying, and the most poorly understood. Look at him. Mark him well. There are millions like him in the dark places of the galaxy, and there will be millions more after he is gone, because the conditions that produce him are written into the very structure of the Imperium. He is the human spirit refined to a single point. He is what remains when faith and trauma and institutional pressure have burned away every other consideration. He is the Emperor's chosen instrument, and he will die for the Emperor today or tomorrow or the day after that, and his death will be useful, and his death will be the only thing about him that ever mattered to anyone. In the depths of Atoma Prime, in the rusting under-warrens of Hive Tertium, the Inquisition gathers such men, such women, such broken and burning souls. They are hauled from holding cells where they have been condemned to die for crimes both real and imagined. They are pulled from penal legions and prison transports. They are dragged from the dust of conquered worlds, and among that press of conscripts and convicts and the merely desperate, the Inquisition finds a particular sort of soul. The believer whose faith has consumed every other faculty until only the burning remains. He walks into oncoming gunfire while reciting his prayers. He throws himself into hordes of corrupted flesh while screaming the name of the Emperor. He carries the Eviscerator chainsword, that great two-handed engine of butchery, not because it is the most efficient tool of war, but because it is the most theologically appropriate. To bisect a heretic with a blade the size of one's own torso is, in the doctrine of the Imperial Creed, a form of prayer. I am Heretical Lore, and today we descend into the under-hive to walk among the chosen of the Inquisition. Today we examine the Zealot. Citizen, attend. The Imperial Creed is the most successful piece of religious engineering in the history of mankind, and you should understand exactly why. It took a man who explicitly rejected godhood, a man who built his Imperium on the foundation of secular reason and the deliberate suppression of superstition, and it transformed him into the central deity of a galaxy-spanning theocracy. The Emperor of mankind, in his lucid days before the heresy, would have ordered the ecclesiarchy purged to the last priest. He fought wars against religion. His thunder warriors burned the temples of false gods on Terra during the Unification Wars, and on Monarchia in the most infamous lesson of the Great Crusade. His own Ultramarines reduced an entire shining city to ash because the word-bearers had dared to build it as a shrine to his divinity. That was then. That was the Imperial truth, the doctrine of reason and science that the Emperor preached to his sons and to the worlds he reclaimed. It is not what you believe today. It is not what your parents believed. It is not what any citizen of the Imperium has been allowed to believe for 10,000 years. Today the Emperor is a god. His name is invoked in every prayer. His image hangs in every chapel. His will is interpreted by an institution that controls more wealth and more souls than any imperial body save perhaps the administratum itself. And this transformation, citizen, was not commanded by the Emperor. It was achieved in his silence. It was achieved by men who saw in his broken body upon the golden throne an opportunity to speak for him. The ecclesiarchy did not always hold this position. Mark this well, because it matters. The institution that you call the Adeptus Ministorum, the institution whose preachers shape your faith from infancy, grew from a single cult called the Temple of the Savior Emperor. That cult emerged in the chaos following the heresy, when humanity needed something to cling to in the face of a galaxy that had revealed itself to be filled with demons and traitors and horrors beyond reckoning. The Emperor, broken upon his throne and unable to speak, became the silent god that mankind had always been told it did not need. And in his silence, the priests spoke for him. They built the cathedrals, they wrote the catechisms, they told the masses, your forebears, that to doubt was damnation, and to die in service was the greatest gift a mortal could offer. By the early centuries of the 36th millennium, the Ministorum had become a power equal to the High Lords of Terror themselves. And then, citizen, came the reign of blood. Hear the name. Remember it. Gog Vandire, master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch both, ruled the Imperium for almost a standard century, with the conviction that he himself spoke with the Emperor's voice. He purged worlds, he virus-bombed planets, he commissioned monuments to himself that overshadowed those of the Emperor. Billions died. Whole sectors were drowned in the blood of his paranoia. And when he was at last cut down by the matriarch of his own bodyguard on the steps of the ecclesiarchal palace, the Imperium had been so deeply wounded that the reforms which followed are still in force today. These reforms produced the decree passive, the law that forbids the ecclesiarchy from gathering, training, or commanding any force of men under arms. Mark the wording. Mark it precisely, because the loophole is the lesson. The ecclesiarchy may not command men under arms. It may, however, command women under arms. And so the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, exist as the ecclesiarchy's military force on the strength of a single archaic gendered noun in a 1,000-year-old proclamation. This is, in my interpretation of the setting, the most perfectly imperial loophole ever recorded. It is theologically dishonest, legally absurd, and absolutely characteristic of how the Imperium actually functions when it requires something done. But the Sisters of Battle are not the only warriors the ecclesiarchy fields. They are merely the most organized. Across the Imperium there are countless smaller orders, fraterist militias, missionary expeditions, and free-roaming preachers who answer to no formal command structure but their own faith. These are the zealots in the broad sense. The wandering priests who carry chainswords as readily as scriptures. The mendicant friars who walk from world to world preaching damnation and salvation in equal measure. The flagellants who whip themselves bloody in the streets of hive cities to atone for sins they have likely never committed. And among them, citizen, there is a particular type. The kind that the Inquisition recruits. The kind we examine today. Now consider the situation upon Atoma Prime. Consider it carefully, because the lesson it teaches is one that every loyal subject of the Imperium must internalize. Atoma Prime is a hive world in the Mebian domain, and the lore established by the Darktide game tells us it has fallen prey to a particularly insidious infection. The forces of chaos, working through the patient corruption of cult sleeper cells, have begun to consume the under-hive of the city of Tertium. The Mobian 6th, the Astra Militarum regiment that should have crushed the rising filth, has itself been compromised. Its officers worship Nurgle in secret. Its troopers spread plague and corruption rather than fight it. They were once heroes of Atoma. They marched in parade through the Thronocide district before they shipped to the fringe. They returned as traitors. Remember this, citizen. The most decorated regiment of your sector can become the gravest threat to your sector. Vigilance is not a virtue. Vigilance is the price of breathing. The Inquisition, in the form of Inquisitor Grendyl of the Ordo Hereticus, has been forced to improvise. Grendyl himself is rarely seen, communicating through hololithic projections and through his senior subordinates aboard the rogue trader vessel Morningstar. Foremost among those subordinates is Interrogator Rannick, the cold and surgical apprentice who runs the Inquisitor's operations from orbit, and Explicator Zola, a former criminal of Tertium who has been raised to apprenticeship and given the task of recruiting the warband's expendable assets directly from the planet's holding cells. The Inquisition does not have time to raise a proper army. It does not have the political capital to call in a Space Marine strike force or to demand reinforcements from the Astra Militarum, because the Mabian command structure is precisely what is rotten. What it has, in abundance, is condemned criminals. The cells beneath Tertium are full of them. Heretics, deserters, thieves, murderers, debtors, vagrants, and the simply unlucky. Grendyl's warband takes these prisoners, offers them a single chance at survival and possible redemption, and throws them at the corruption like a fire hose of expendable flesh. They are called, in the cold parlance of the Morningstar's records, re-jects. Most of them die. Some survive long enough to become useful. And among the survivors, the most useful of all are those who do not need to be motivated, because their motivation is already a fire that consumes them from within. They are the Zealots, and within the Inquisition's classification of the re-jects, they are formally designated as Zealot preachers. Understand this clearly. The Zealot is not a member of any formal order. They are not ecclesiarchy priests in any official sense, nor are they sisters of battle. They are something messier. Each one has a story, and in my reading of the game's lore, those stories follow a pattern you must recognize. The Zealot has lost something, often everything. Family devoured by mutants in a hive sump, a congregation slaughtered by cultists during a festival, a home world destroyed by demonic incursion. A child taken by the black ships and never seen again. The specific tragedy varies, the shape does not. The Zealot was a normal Imperial citizen, perhaps no different from you, who encountered something so monstrous that ordinary belief could not survive the contact. And in the wreckage of that contact, faith metastasized. Hear this and remember it. Faith in the Imperium is not gentle. It is not the comforting belief in a loving God who watches over his children. The Emperor does not love anyone in any meaningful sense. He cannot. He is a corpse on a machine that keeps the Astronomicon burning, and he has not spoken a coherent word to mortal beings in 10,000 years, if indeed he ever did in the way the ecclesiarchy claims. The faith of the Imperium is not a faith of comfort. It is a faith of defiance. It is the human spirit refusing to bow before the horrors of the galaxy by clinging to the one symbol of unity that humanity has left. To believe in the Emperor is not to believe that he will save you. It is to believe that you will die in his service and that your death will mean something. This is the doctrine. Memorize it, live by it, or be replaced by someone who will. The Zealot has internalized this completely. He does not expect to live. He does not particularly want to live. He wants to die well, and he wants to take as many of the Emperor's enemies with him as he can manage on the way out. This, citizen, is what makes him so terrifyingly useful. A soldier who fears death can be broken. A soldier who hopes to survive can be tempted, bribed, or made to hesitate. A Zealot has no such weakness. He walks through gunfire because the bullets cannot frighten him. He charges daemons because daemons are exactly what he came to find. He dies screaming praise to the Emperor, and he dies smiling because in his reading of reality, this was always the only correct ending. Look upon him and learn. The Imperium does not need heroes who survive. The Imperium needs heroes who die in the right direction. Now attend to his armament, because the weapons of the Zealot are themselves a sermon written in chain-driven steel. Consider the Eviscerator. This is the chainsword that defines the Zealot archetype in the Darktide setting, and it is, by any rational measure, an absurd weapon. It is too large, it is too heavy, it is too slow. Its enormous teeth and crude disruption field are built to bisect armored men in a single stroke, and to gnaw through walls and the lighter plating of vehicles, which means that against an unarmored cultist it is wildly excessive. A power sword would be more efficient. A simple chain sword would be lighter and faster. But the Eviscerator is not chosen for efficiency. It is chosen for what it represents. To swing an Eviscerator is to declare, with every revolution of its motorized teeth, that the wielder is here to butcher the enemies of mankind in the most violently theatrical manner possible. It is, in my interpretation, the single most spiritually appropriate weapon in the Darktide arsenal for what the Zealot is actually doing on the battlefield. There are other weapons in the Zealot arsenal, and you will recognize their purposes. The heavy Eviscerator, a still larger pattern, whose razor teeth can tear through flesh and armor with equal ease, reserved for those moments when the foe in front of the Zealot is something that mere mortals would prefer to engage from the next continent over. The Crusher, a great two-handed power maul, suited to those Zealots who prefer their theology delivered as concussive impact. The Thunder Hammer, a single-target executioner's tool that combines piety with electrified ruin, charged before each blow as a priest charges a censer with incense. The Heavy Sword, faster than the others but no less brutal. Stub revolvers and auto-pistols for those moments when the enemy must be shot rather than dismembered. Combat axes and combat knives for the close work. The Flamer, that roaring purgative tool which the Zealot wields with particular satisfaction because no weapon in the Imperial arsenal more perfectly captures the doctrine of the ecclesiarchy than fire applied directly to heretical flesh. And the bolt gun in its various patterns, which the Zealot wields not as a soldier wields a rifle, but as a priest wields a thurible, each thunderous report a hymn fired into the bodies of the unworthy. The Eviscerator itself has a longer pedigree than its appearance in the under-hive of Tertium might suggest, and you must understand where the weapon comes from. It originates, in the Imperial arsenal, as a weapon of penance. The Sister Repentia of the Adepta Sororitas, those fallen warrior nuns who have transgressed against their order's strict code, are stripped of their armor and given the Eviscerator as the instrument of their redemption. Wearing nothing but rags and prayer scrolls, they charge into battle, clutching this two-handed engine of butchery, knowing that only death in service of the Emperor will redeem the sin they carry. The Eviscerator, in its origin, is the weapon of the soul that has failed and seeks to die well. It is the chosen tool of those who believe their continued existence is itself a form of blasphemy, and who therefore seek to translate that existence into as much enemy carnage as possible before the inevitable end. This, in my interpretation, is exactly why the Zealot preacher gravitates toward the same weapon. The Zealot is not formally a Repentia. He has not been drummed out of any order, and most have never been part of one to begin with. But the psychology is identical. The Zealot believes on some level that he should not have survived whatever calamity made him what he is. The family devoured in the sump, the congregation slaughtered at the festival, the home world burned. The Zealot walked away from these horrors when others did not, and that walking away is in his private theology a debt that must be paid. The Eviscerator is the instrument of payment. Each swing of those motorized teeth is a coin in the slot of a cosmic toll booth that the Zealot has been trying to satisfy ever since he first picked up the weapon. The toll booth, of course, never gives change. There is always more to pay. There is always another heretic who deserves the chain blade, another mutant who must be cleansed, another corrupted thing in the dark that needs to be parted from its limbs. Citizen, you should also know of the redemption cults, those fringe ecclesiarchical movements that have made the Eviscerator their unofficial sacrament. The redemptionists are extremist preachers and their followers who travel from hive to hive, proclaiming that the only path to salvation is the violent purgation of sin, both external and internal. They flagellate themselves, they carry chainswords and torches, they identify a target population, declare them irredeemable, and butcher them with the full conviction that the Emperor approves. The Imperial authorities tolerate the redemptionists when their violence is pointed at acceptable targets, which in the under-hive of any given world is most of the time, and the Inquisition occasionally recruits from their ranks when the cults produce individuals who are useful and not yet completely insane. The Zealot preacher of Atoma Prime is, in many cases, a graduate of such a cult, or a fellow traveller. The line between the sanctioned zealot and the unsanctioned redemptionist is, in the lore, vanishingly thin. It comes down mostly to whether the Inquisition has signed off on the violence in advance. The zealot's armour, such as it is, tells its own story, and you would do well to learn the visual language of it. Where the veteran wears proper Imperial Guard flak and the Ogryn wears reinforced industrial plate, the zealot wears whatever has been scavenged, blessed and sanctified through long use. Heavy robes layered over piecemeal armour. Bandoliers of purity, seals that flutter as he charges. Hoods and masks that obscure the face, because what matters is not the individual beneath the cloth, but the function the cloth serves. Some zealots wear the iconography of specific saints. Others festoon themselves with skulls and bones, trophies of past battles, reminders of mortality that they intend to inflict on others. The aesthetic is medieval in a way that the rest of the Imperium often only gestures at. The zealot looks like a flagellant out of an earth woodcut from the 14th century, transposed forward 40,000 years and given a chainsword the size of his torso. His combat doctrine, insofar as such a word can be applied to organized fanaticism, revolves around closing the distance. Where the veteran picks targets at range and the psyker manipulates the materium to strike from afar, the zealot wants to be in the middle of things. He wants his hands on the enemy. He wants to feel the chainsword bite and the bolt round detonate at point-blank range. There is a sacramental quality to this. The zealot believes, on some level, that killing the Emperor's enemies up close is a more meaningful act of worship than killing them at distance. It is the difference in his theology between offering incense and offering blood. Both are acts of devotion. Blood is the older offering and the more honest one. This doctrine is reflected in the zealot's mechanical abilities within the Darktide setting itself, and those mechanics are, in my interpretation, a fair gloss on the lore. The zealot's signature ability is called Chastise the Wicked, which sends him dashing forward at supernatural speed, replenishing his toughness and empowering his next blow with critical force. His faith protects him in those critical seconds when a less devoted soldier would be cut down. He strikes harder when bleeding, when close to death, because the proximity of martyrdom focuses him rather than distracting him. His aura, the protective resonance he projects to his fellow re-jects, is called the Emperor's Will. The name is not marketing. The name is meant literally. In the lore, these are presented as actual manifestations of belief made manifest. The zealot's faith is not metaphorical. In the warp-soaked reality of the 41st millennium, belief has weight and substance, and a sufficiently devoted citizen can translate that belief into something resembling miraculous protection. Hear me now, citizen, because this point matters more than any other in this broadcast. In the Imperium of Man, faith does sometimes work. Saint Celestine walks through impossible odds and emerges unwounded. The living saints of the Sisters of Battle perform feats that violate physics. Imperial preachers have been documented driving back daemons through the sheer force of their conviction. The standard scholarly explanation, in the meta-lore of the setting, is that the Emperor may indeed be a nascent god in the warp, and that the collective belief of his trillions of followers feeds and shapes that godhood. Whether or not the Emperor exists as a deity in any formal sense, the act of believing in him generates real metaphysical force. The Zealot is, in a sense, a battery. The faith he pours into his work charges the warp around him with protective resonance. It is not that the Emperor specifically reaches down to save him. It is that the act of faith itself, in a universe where psychic energy is real and belief is a form of psychic energy, produces effects. This makes the Zealot a curious kind of psyker without a sanctioning, a faith warrior whose abilities derive from precisely the same fundamental forces that drive the Astra Telepathica and the sanctioned psyker cores, but routed through a different channel. The psyker reaches into the warp and pulls power out by force of will. The Zealot keeps the warp at bay by force of belief. Both are doing something with the same underlying material. The Imperium does not officially acknowledge this equivalence, citizen, because to acknowledge it would be to admit that the ecclesiarchy is essentially a state-sanctioned psychic cult, and that admission would unravel a great deal of carefully maintained theological architecture. So instead, the Imperium maintains the fiction that faith and witchcraft are entirely different phenomena. In my interpretation, they are points on the same spectrum. The Inquisition understands this distinction better than most, which is why the Inquisition is so willing to use zealots. The Inquisitor who recruits a zealot for a strike team is, knowingly or not, drafting a faith-powered psyker without the regulatory headache of a sanctioned witch. The Zealot does not need to be tested by the black ships. He does not need to be psychically null-collared or watched for demonic possession in the same formal way. His power is officially religious rather than warp-derived, and the Inquisition can, with a clean conscience, point to the Ministerum's own teachings as justification for using him. It is a beautiful piece of bureaucratic theatre, and it is exactly the kind of arrangement that the Imperium runs on. Now, hear the warning beneath the doctrine. The Darktide setting gestures toward this without quite naming it directly, and you must hear it named clearly. The line between the Zealot and the heretic is, in some sense, paper-thin. Both are extremists. Both have rejected ordinary social functioning in favor of an absolute commitment to a higher truth. The Zealot serves the Emperor, the Chaos Cultist serves the ruinous powers. But the psychological architecture is identical. They are both citizens who have decided that nothing in this life matters except service to a transcendent cause. And that service can be paid for in any quantity of blood, including their own. What separates them in the Imperial reading is the object of their devotion. What separates them in the Warp's reading is more ambiguous. Both Zealot and Heretic generate devotional energy. Both feed something larger than themselves. The difference is direction, not magnitude. There are recorded cases in the broader canon of Zealots who fell. Cases where the very intensity of their faith made them susceptible to corruption, because chaos is patient and will accept devotion routed through any channel. A zealot who begins to doubt, who suffers a crisis of faith but cannot allow himself to acknowledge the doubt, is in some ways more vulnerable to subtle corruption than an ordinary citizen would be. He cannot admit weakness. He cannot ask for help. He can only push harder, fight harder, hate harder. And hatred, citizen, even hatred of the right enemy, is one of the gateways through which the ruinous powers most readily enter. Watch for this. Watch for it in others. Watch for it in yourself. This is part of why the Inquisition uses zealots and then, often, disposes of them. The zealot is useful in the moment. He will charge the cultist line. He will hold the choke point. He will go into the demon-infested ruin, where no sane operator would venture, and he will come out covered in ichor and singing hymns. But afterward, when the operation is complete, The Zealot has been exposed. He has seen things. He has killed things he was not, by Imperial standards, supposed to know existed. And he is, as a class of agent, almost impossible to control. He does not respond to threats because death does not frighten him. He does not respond to bribery because he has rejected material concerns. He responds only to authority that he himself recognizes as legitimate. And that authority, for many Zealots, is solely the perceived voice of the Emperor speaking through their own conscience. So the Inquisition uses them, and then, when they are no longer useful, the Inquisition arranges for them to die. Not always, not deliberately in every case, but with sufficient frequency that any thoughtful Zealot who survives a half-dozen operations begins to understand that his longevity is itself a suspicious anomaly. The lucky ones are sent on missions that require martyrdom. The luckier ones simply meet enemies they cannot defeat. The very few who survive long enough to become a problem are usually quietly redirected toward isolated assignments from which they do not return. This is not, in my reading, a betrayal of the Zealot's faith. It is, in fact, the Imperium delivering exactly what the Zealot wanted from the beginning, a meaningful death in service of the Emperor. The Inquisition simply provides the infrastructure to ensure that the death arrives on schedule. The cold pragmatism of this arrangement, citizen, is one of the things that makes the Zealot archetype so darkly fascinating. The Zealot believes himself to be a free agent of the Emperor's will. The Imperium treats him as a disposable munition with religious icing. Both readings are correct. The Zealot is a free agent in the sense that he cannot be coerced. He cannot be ordered to act against his faith. He will defy any command he perceives as heretical. But he is also disposable in the sense that the Imperium does not need any specific Zealot to survive any specific encounter. There are always more. The hive cities of 1 billion worlds churn out broken human beings by the millions every year, and a non-trivial percentage of them, given the right combination of trauma and faith, can be transformed into Zealots. The supply is functionally infinite. The individual Zealot is therefore, by the cold calculus of Imperial logistics, of vanishing importance. Consider also the Zealot's relationship with his fellow re-jects in the close confines of an Inquisition strike team. This is one of the more instructive textures in the Darktide setting. The Zealot looks at the veteran, the Astra Militarum survivor, with grudging respect, provided the veteran demonstrates sufficient faith. He looks at the Ogryn, the Abhuman shock trooper, with the kind of patronizing affection that a missionary might extend to a particularly devout but theologically simple peasant. He looks at the Psyker, the sanctioned witch, with open suspicion bordering on hostility, because the Psyker represents everything that the Imperial creed has taught the Zealot to distrust. The Psyker is a witch with papers. The Zealot understands that the Imperium uses Psykers because the Imperium has no choice. He understands that the Astronomicon burns by witchcraft, and that the Navis Nobilite are themselves a bloodline of mutant psychics. But he does not have to like it. He watches the Psyker for signs of corruption, for any flicker of the warp showing through the cracks of the human shell, and at the first sign of perdition, the Zealot's chainsword will, by his own internal reckoning, be the appropriate answer. This is not officially his job. He considers it a duty regardless. The Inquisition, knowing exactly what kind of personality it is recruiting, regards this paranoia as a feature rather than a bug. The Zealot is, in effect, a backup safety on the Psyker that no one has to acknowledge in writing. What this produces, citizen, in the texture of the Imperium, is a particular sort of warrior unique to this setting. Other settings have fanatics. Other settings have holy warriors. The 41st Millennium Zealot is something specific, and that specificity comes from the marriage of medieval religious imagery with 10,000-year-old institutional decay. The Zealot is not a crusader. The crusader believed in the recovery of Holy Land and the establishment of a kingdom of God. The Zealot has no such hope. He does not believe the Emperor will return in glory and establish a paradise. He knows, on some level, that the Emperor is broken and that his Imperium is dying. His faith is faith in spite of that. It is faith that has accepted the futility of the cosmic situation and chosen to fight anyway, because to do otherwise would be to surrender to the ruinous powers, and surrender is the one thing the Zealot will not contemplate. This, in my reading, is the deepest truth of what the Zealot represents. He is the Imperium's answer to despair. He is the human spirit that has looked into the abyss of the 41st millennium, has understood that there is no rescue coming, that the Emperor will not stride forth from the throne, that the Primarchs will not all return, that the galaxy is being consumed by Tyranids and Necrons and the rising tide of chaos, and has decided that none of that matters. The Zealot fights not because he expects to win. He fights because fighting is the only meaningful response to a universe that has revealed itself to be malevolent. He dies because dying in defiance is preferable to living in submission. And in the moment of his death, when the eviscerator falls from his bloody hands and the final prayer breaks on his lips, he is, for that instant, more free than any cardinal or inquisitor or high lord of terror. He has given everything and received the only thing he ever wanted, which is the certainty that his existence had a purpose. Look again at Atoma Prime. The Inquisition's strike teams continue to push deeper into the corrupted under-hive of Tertium. The cultists of the admonition rise from places that should have been sealed centuries ago. Poxwalkers and chaos spawn lurch through habs that have been condemned and reclaimed and condemned again across the long reign of Imperial neglect. And the Zealots walk among them, robes stiff with old blood, scriptures memorized to the point that the words have become a kind of breathing, ready to deliver the Emperor's judgment with chain-driven teeth and burning conviction. They are the sharpest expression of a particular Imperial ideal, and they are in many ways what the Imperium itself has always wanted to be. Pure, singular, burning. What they are not, citizen, is sane. But sanity in the 41st millennium has long since ceased to be a virtue. The galaxy is not sane. The Emperor is not sane if he can be said to think at all. The Imperium that worships him is the longest-running collective psychotic episode in human history. In such a universe, the Zealot is not an aberration. He is, in some ways, the most complete and most honest expression of what the Imperium has become. He has stopped pretending that things will get better. He has stopped pretending that reason will save him. He has surrendered to the logic of the setting, which is that everything ends in fire. And he has decided to be the one holding the torch. That is the Zealot, as I read him. Not a hero in any meaningful sense, because heroism implies a moral framework that rewards survival and progress. Not a villain, because the things he fights are objectively worse than he is. He is something stranger. He is what is left of the human spirit when every other consolation has been stripped away, when family and home and hope have all been burned to ash, and only the burning remains. In the rusted under-warrens beneath Atoma Prime, in the cathedrals built into the rusted bones of forgotten manufactoria, in the silent shrines where candles burn before the Emperor's image and the air smells of incense and old blood, the Zealots gather. They sharpen their blades. They mutter their prayers. They wait for the Inquisition's next call, knowing full well that each call is more likely than the last to be the final one. And when the call comes, citizen, they answer. They always answer. The Emperor protects. In their reading of reality, anyway. And in the 41st millennium, sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the belief itself is the protection. Sometimes the chainsaw does cut through the thing that should have been impervious. Sometimes the bolt round does find the heart of the daemon that should have shrugged off lesser fire. Sometimes faith works in the strange physics of the warp-soaked galaxy, and sometimes the zealot walks out of the engagement with his robes tattered and his flesh torn and his voice broken from screaming hymns, but his soul, by his own reckoning, intact. And sometimes faith does not work, and the zealot falls and is carried out on a stretcher and is interred in some forgotten Ministorum vault with a dozen others who did not return from that day's mission. There is no monument. There is no public mourning. The Inquisition does not, as a rule, advertise its losses. But somewhere in the records of Tertium, in the dusty ledgers of the Ministorum office that processes the ecclesiastical dead, there is a name. And in the chapels of the under-hive, where the survivors gather to drink rough amasek and to mutter to each other about the ones who did not come back, the zealot is remembered. Briefly, then forgotten as the next mission comes, and the next, and the next. This is the life of the zealot. This is the role he plays in the great machine of the Imperium. This is what he is, and what he chooses to be, and what he would not, given the chance, choose to be otherwise. There are individual zealots whose stories have been preserved in the lore of the Darktide game and the broader 40k canon. The veteran preachers of the Tempestus regiments, the wandering missionaries who have crossed the Segmentum on foot, leaving sermons and corpses in equal measure in their wake. The flagellants whose faith burned so bright that they began to glow, in the literal sense, before they died screaming in some forgotten engagement. The sisters who renounced their order to take up the path of the lone zealot, whose names are inscribed on no roll of honor, but who are remembered dimly in the oral traditions of the Imperial Guard regiments they served alongside. These individual stories matter, and they form part of the tapestry of what it means to be a zealot in the 41st millennium. But the broader truth of the archetype is what I have laid out for you here. They are the believers who have given everything to a God who cannot answer them, and who continue to give in the certainty that the giving itself is the point. In my own reading of this setting, after years of swimming in its lore and trying to make sense of its theology, the zealot is one of the figures that most clearly captures what 40k is about. The Imperium is not a place of hope. It is not a place of progress. It is a place where humanity, having reached its apex and then fallen back into a long twilight, fights on by the sheer momentum of having always fought on. The zealot embodies that momentum. He is the inertia of human defiance, made flesh and given a chainsword. He will not stop because stopping is unthinkable. He will not surrender because surrender is the one thing he refuses. And in his refusal, in his burning insistence that mankind will not bow to the abyss, there is something that might, in a kinder universe, have been called heroism. But this is not a kind universe, citizen. This is the 41st millennium. And so the zealot is not a hero. He is simply what happens when faith and trauma and the institutional machinery of the Imperium intersect in just the right way to produce a human being who has stopped fearing death and started weaponizing it. He walks into the dark. He carries the light, such as it is, of his burning belief. And when he falls, as he always eventually falls, he falls facing the enemy, with the Emperor's name on his lips and the chainsword still spinning in his dying hands. The Emperor protects. So they say, so they believe. And in their believing, in the depths of Atoma Prime and 1,000 other worlds across the long-broken Imperium of man, the believing itself becomes a kind of armor, and the armor becomes a kind of sword, and the sword cuts deep into the flesh of a galaxy that would, given any other response, devour mankind whole. That is the zealot. That is what he was made for. And in the rusted under-hive of tertium, the next ones are already being recruited from the holding cells, given their first chainsword, told their first sermon, and pushed forward into the dark to begin the work that ends, for all of them, in only one possible way. The work continues. The faith burns. The chain blades sing, and the Emperor on his throne, 10,000 years dead and 10,000 light years distant, does not answer. He does not need to. The Zealot answers for him. And in that answer, terrible and beautiful and entirely insane, is the closest thing to grace that the 41st millennium will ever produce. Attend, citizen. Remember what you have heard. The broadcast ends. The work does not.